In the 13th century before Christ, during the reign of Pharaoh Ramses II, Thebes stood as the glittering heart of Egypt's empire. But behind its temples of gold and halls of praise, there existed a law no scribe dared record. When a royal woman defied the will of the living God, she was not executed, she was erased. No trial, no tomb, only disappearance. They called it purity. But what happened to the pharaoh's wives, daughters, and sisters who dared to disobey was anything but holy. Their voices were buried deeper than their bodies. The year was around 1278 before Christ, and Thebes pulsed with the heat of high summer. Ramses II, the god-king of Egypt, had ruled for nearly 5 years, and already his reign was written in towering statues and carved hymns. But what the limestone could not show were the women gone missing from his palace, the ones whose names no longer appeared in temple prayers. Nefira was the youngest daughter of a noble house bound to the royal court through trade and marriage. She had refused a union decreed by Ramses himself, a political gesture masked as a divine command. Her refusal was spoken only once, in a voice calm but unwavering, and it had been enough. Before sunrise the next day, guards in leopard skin sashes appeared at her chamber. They offered no accusations, only silence. Her wrists were bound with silk cords, not rope. No bruises were to mark the pharaoh's disobedient bride. As she was escorted through the stone halls of the eastern palace, slaves lowered their eyes, and scribes paused their tablets mid-stroke. No one dared speak her name. Outside, the streets of Thebes were alive with worship. The festival of Ra approached, and incense curled around columns painted with stars. Yet Nefira was led away from the crowds, toward the western edge of the city, where the tombs of the nobles slept beneath sand. There stood a white-walled compound, so smooth and clean it seemed untouched by time. No windows, no banners, just 2 guards at its gate, and the symbol of Ma'at, truth and balance, etched above the door in faded ochre. It was called the House of Purity. But no one who entered it ever left. Inside, the air changed. It was cooler, thicker. The scent of myrrh clung to every stone. Women in white linen moved without speaking, their heads shaved, their faces hidden beneath translucent veils. One took Nefira's necklace, another cut a lock of her hair. A third whispered a single phrase, "You will serve the Eternal." Her voice cracked halfway through. Nefira did not cry. She only turned her head toward the veiled priestess and said, "Even the Nile breaks its banks when held too long." The priestess flinched. Then she lowered her gaze, took Nefira's hand, and led her deeper into the halls toward the chamber, where names were unspoken, and the pharaoh's will was absolute. The House of Purity sat like a tomb in waiting, carved not from stone but from obedience. Though its walls were bathed in sunlight, the chambers inside knew only shadows. Nefira walked barefoot across polished limestone, her ankles dusted with chalk, her wrists unbound but heavy with absence. She had not been struck, she had not been screamed at, and that was what unsettled her most. The women who moved around her were not jailers, not exactly. They were former wives, once cherished sisters, concubines too clever, daughters too proud. Each had entered these halls as punishment for disobedience. And now, they served a ritual more ancient than even the gods themselves. Transformation through silence. In the outer sanctum, a basin of still water waited. Nefira was undressed by unseen hands. Her gown was taken, folded, and removed as though it carried the memory of sin. Her body was then rubbed with crushed lotus and oil, the scent thick enough to smother breath. A blade small and ceremonial was passed over her scalp. One clean sweep, hair pooled at her feet like proof of vanishing. No mirrors were offered, only stillness. She was wrapped in linen so white it made her skin appear gold, and taken to the chamber of reflection. The room had no corners. Its walls were curved and lined with gold-leafed panels that distorted the image of anyone who looked into them. Nefira saw herself multiplied in 100 twisted forms, tall and thin, short and bloated, aged and childlike, faceless and crowned. In the center of the chamber stood an altar upon which rested a mask. It was molded from hammered gold, cold and expressionless. It bore no name, only the stylized brows and closed lips of a woman in eternal agreement. "Do you know who this is?" a voice asked from behind her. Nefira turned. An elder priestess stood cloaked in linen darker than the others. a mark of her years inside. Her face was not veiled. Her eyes were sunken, but her gaze was sharp. "They say it is a goddess," the woman continued, circling the altar. "But it is not. This mask was once a face, worn by a girl like you." She questioned why the gods demanded silence, and so the pharaoh gave her what she asked for: stillness. Forever. The mask was pressed into Nefira's hands. It was heavier than it looked. Her arms trembled, but she did not drop it. She stared into its hollow sockets, and for a moment she thought she saw her own face staring back. "You are to become what he wants," the priestess said. "A symbol, a warning, a work of art." Then she turned and vanished into the shadows. Nefira stood alone in the chamber, the mask resting in her palms like a second skull. Somewhere above, Thebes celebrated the festival of Ra, but down here the only god was fear, and it wore a woman's face. The workshop beneath the palace had no windows. It was lit by oil lamps that never went out, and filled with the scent of crushed limestone and burning resin. Menka had worked there since boyhood, sculpting the faces of kings and gods, but nothing unsettled him more than the assignments that came sealed with the black wax of the House of Purity. He had received 3 such scrolls in his life. The first left him sleepless, the second made him sick, the third had just arrived, and it bore a name he would not read because it had been scratched out. All that remained was a face, a sketch, drawn in charcoal, of a woman with proud eyes and lips unsmiling. There was something alive in the expression, as though the drawing itself were resisting. He knew better than to ask questions. He collected his tools and set to work on a block of alabaster taller than himself. The face came slowly, first through suggestion, then through pain. He carved the jaw with trembling hands, paused often at the nose, and lingered far too long on the curve of the lips. On the 4th day, he left the studio and walked to the banks of the Nile. He needed to see people with names. He watched children play in the mud, and women wash clothes beneath the shade of sycamore trees. No gold, no silence, just voices. When he returned, the statue was nearly finished, but he noticed something he had not done. The eyes. They were too precise, too familiar. They were not stone. They were hers. He stepped back. For a moment, he could not breathe. A whisper echoed in the back of his mind, one he had not heard since he was a child. "The gods watch through the things we make." He tried to continue, but the next morning he was summoned, not to the House of Purity, but to the Hall of Echoes, a chamber beneath the temple used for rituals and secrets. There, he was met not by priests but by guards, and they said only one thing: she must be finished in gold. Menka knew what that meant. It was not merely ornament, it was sealing. He was led to a back room where a figure stood wrapped in linen, upright as if already a statue. Her face was exposed. It was the woman he had carved, but this time there was no charcoal, no sketch, just skin, still warm, and lips slightly parted. Not dead, not yet. The priest beside him handed him a thin mask of hammered gold and said, "Apply it while she breathes." That is the pharaoh's command. Menka froze. He looked at her one last time and saw a tear falling from her closed eye, silent as the grave they were building around her. Then he lifted the mask, and the light in the room bent as if ashamed. The year was still 1278 before Christ, but the air in Thebes felt older, thicker with secrets that even the priests no longer dared to name. Nefira had not spoken in days. Her voice was intact, but there was nowhere to place it. The House of Purity was not a prison made of iron, it was a ritual built from erasure. Names were the first to go, then hair, then mirrors. Now they came for memory. Each morning, she woke to the sound of chanting, not prayers, but syllables repeated endlessly, designed not to worship but to unmake. And every night, the same dream returned, a hallway of gold, a woman with a crown, eyes full of rage, and a voice whispering, "I was first." The priestesses never spoke of her, but the walls did. Behind one of the ceremonial curtains, Nefira found a mural half scrubbed away. It showed a royal woman seated beside the pharaoh, her hand raised not in obedience but in argument. Her name had been chiseled out, her mouth painted over in white, but her crown remained, double-plumed. the symbol of the great royal wife. Nefira waited until nightfall. She lit a lamp and returned to the mural alone. This time, she spoke. "What did you say that frightened him?" The flame flickered violently, though there was no wind. Then the room grew cold, not the chill of stone, but the breath of something that had once been alive and was now only hunger. Nefira did not turn around. She knew what haunted these halls. Queen Satya, the pharaoh's first wife, had once ruled beside him in the early years of his reign. A woman of noble blood, educated by priests, respected by scribes, until she questioned his claim to divinity. The rains had not come. The granaries were half empty. And Satya had asked before the entire court, would a god let children starve? By morning, she had disappeared. No tomb was ever found. No priest was allowed to speak her name. But in the house of purity, her silence was everywhere. They said her spirit lingered in the gold-lined walls, feeding on the forgotten, that when you dream of her, you begin to remember too much. Nefira saw her more clearly each night now, the crown, the clenched jaw, the fire behind her eyes, and always the same whisper, "They erase us because we know." One evening, Nefira awoke to find a single lotus petal placed on her chest. It was fresh. No priestess had entered her chamber. No sound had stirred. But the message was clear. Someone remembered. Someone still mourned. And perhaps, beneath the ash of all this beauty, the fire had never truly gone out. The sandstorm came without warning. One moment, the sky above Thebes burned clear with the heat of Ra's gaze. The next, it darkened as if swallowed by a god. Winds howled across the Nile, lifting dust from the tomb roads and throwing it against the temple gates. The people called it an omen. The priests called it a test. But in the house of purity, where omens were buried and tests were suffered in silence, it was seen for what it truly was, a distraction. That night, while the storm raged above, a passage opened below. A section of floor beneath the bathing hall had cracked during the tremor of the wind. The priestesses sealed the chamber quickly, afraid of bad luck, but Menka had seen it. The sculptor had returned, summoned once again by the pharaoh's decree to prepare another golden face. But Menka no longer obeyed without condition. Not after Nefira. Not after the mask he had pressed to her skin. She had not screamed. She had only wept. That silence haunted him more than any curse. As the temple shook, and priests prayed loudly to keep the dead asleep, Menka slipped past the courtyard guards. He knew where they kept the unfinished bodies, the ones not yet sealed in art. He descended through the broken floor, torch in hand, the flame dancing like a frightened child. The passage led to a vault so old it predated even the house of purity. Here, statues stood in rows not of gods, but of women. None bore names. Some were cracked, their insides exposed. Linen, bone, resin, proof. And there, near the farthest wall, wrapped in ceremonial white, stood Nefira. Her golden mask had been removed. Her eyes were closed, but she breathed. Barely. Her hands were bound in lotus thread, but her fingers twitched. Menka dropped to his knees. "I have no gods left," he whispered, "but I will not let them bury you." She did not speak, but a tear slipped down her cheek. That was enough. He lifted her gently, cradling her like a child carved from clay, and began to carry her through the narrow tunnel. The vault moaned as if waking. Dust rained down, statues cracked. Somewhere above, thunder rolled not from the sky, but from the fury of gods forgotten. As Menka and Nefira emerged into the open air, the sandstorm parted for a breathless moment, revealing the city, the Nile, and the torchlit temples of Thebes. It was the first time Nefira had seen the stars in weeks. Her voice rasped from her throat like wind through reeds. "Burn it," she said. Menka nodded. He turned, torch in hand, and dropped it into the open vault. The flames rushed upward like vengeance finally named, and below, the statues screamed in silence as the house of purity began to devour itself from within. By the time the sun returned to Thebes, the house of purity stood untouched above ground, its walls still white, its gates still guarded, its silence still unbroken. But beneath it, the fire had done its work. The vault of golden women was gone. The masks had melted into the bone. The statues had cracked open, revealing not gods, but victims. Those who entered to assess the damage said nothing in their reports. They dared not. The pharaoh commanded a wall to be built over the site, not to protect it, but to hide it. And so, it vanished, sealed beneath stone, buried under new rituals, newer lies. Menka was never seen again. Some say he fled to Nubia, others that he drowned himself in the Nile. But there were whispers that he carved a final statue before he disappeared, one that bore no gold, no name, no flattery, just a woman, standing tall, her mouth slightly open, as if speaking something forbidden. As for Nefira, no scroll recorded her death, no temple sang her name, but in the outer villages beyond Thebes, stories began to bloom. Women left small offerings at the roots of sycamore trees. Not to the gods. To her. A petal, a lock of hair, a shard of mirror, and when their daughters asked who the gifts were for, the mothers only said, "The one who remembered." Centuries passed, pharaohs rose and fell, the house of purity crumbled into myth. Then one season, during a drought unlike any before, a group of workers restoring a collapsed shrine unearthed a stone chamber with scorched walls. Inside, they found no treasure, no scrolls, just a single cartouche carved in jagged lines, as though scratched in haste, Nefira. The scholars dismissed it as nonsense, a folk name, a trick of time. But the excavation was closed without reason, and the stones above the chamber were replaced the next day. Some say the wind still carries her voice across the sand when the sun bleeds into the horizon. Not crying, not pleading, just whispering. A soft defiance that never died, a warning that silence, once broken, becomes a weapon sharper than any blade. Because no matter how many masks they cast, no matter how many names they erase, truth always finds its way back to the light. If this story moved you, remember history does not protect the forgotten, it buries them, and unless we dig, unless we listen, their silence becomes ours. So ask yourself, who did they try to erase in your world? And what will you do with their memory?